I'm not such an old time server as Gwyn here, who was here through the Blitz. I came in quite a long while later, but have in that period analysed the evolution of the various planning proposals. And it really is a fascinating story, because before the war, Coventry city centre was under enormous pressure in that the population had increased from about 70,000 in 1900 to, in 1939, 220,000. And with that rapid expansion, the difficulty was how a congested city centre could in fact cope with this enormous expansion of services. The other difficulty, besides wanting to improve all the civic amenities, the area of the shopping provision, the business facilities, the cultural facilities, was one of congestion, in that Coventry was a traditional radial city, effectively like a wheel with the spokes of the various main roads coming into the city centre at Broadgate. And that crossroads was really formed particularly by Smithford Street across to High Street, and in the other direction, Hertford Street into the Burges. And so, with the increase of vehicular traffic, that hub was becoming more and more congested, and there clearly needed to be a radical solution. Before the war, the City Council, the Civic Guild were all concerned how to solve the problem, how to make space for development, but at the same time tackle congestion. Therefore, the bombing, in effect, became an opportunity.
Solved your problem.
And certainly gave the opportunity for change. The destruction was very much in that congested commercial centre, shopping centre. There had been, before that happening in 1940, various alternative, I'll call them sketch proposals, models, because of the concerns of the citizens and the professionals. So there was an immediate challenge on the City Council. They realised something had to be done quickly, both to keep the city active, working, but on the other hand, to be forward-looking for the future. Now, they had, before the war, professionally, began to prepare the way, in the sense that they had a city engineer, Ernest Ford, who was really interested, particularly in the engineering, road aspects and so on, but in broader planning aspects too. And then 1938, beginning of 1939, Donald Gibson came in as a new city architect. And the City Council really looked to these two professionals to come forward with ideas. They had differing background and therefore, in a sense, a different approach. The scale and type of redevelopment. So the City Council, immediately after the bombing, in a sense gave them a competitive challenge. Knowing their background was different, they said to each of them, will you prepare some alternatives for us to examine? And within a very, very short time of a few weeks, proposals came forward from each of them. I suppose the city engineer's proposals, as one might expect, tended to accept some comprehensive development in the shopping area where there was the most devastation, but otherwise to take in general the existing road patterns and improve them to take increased traffic, but by and large keep that pattern of development. On the other hand, Donald Gibson and his team felt there should be a much more radical solution with very definite change in comprehensive redevelopment. They, in a sense, adopted more of a clean sheet, having regard, of course, to what the areas of main devastation were and where opportunities were. They perhaps caught the imagination more of the City Council to radical change, and it was particularly centred on the shopping area that we now know as the precinct, by the introduction of a significant pedestrian area, shopping either side, some offices included, a formal layout in that the visual axis of that was to be aligned on the cathedral's spires, as we now see it standing at the bottom of the precinct. Rather a grandiose conception. But although it is that area that remains primarily of the Gibson plan, which was the separation of pedestrians from traffic, at least in the shopping area, it developed that concept also to the cathedral area. And it assumed that there could be redevelopment clearing out even a lot of the buildings that had not been bombed. And so, for example, it assumed from what we now know as Broadgate to the area of Holy Trinity and the Cathedral and Council House to be completely cleared and opened up as green space. And in the other direction, a right angle axis through Broadgate, it took an alignment to the railway station and intended to open up there a long parkway axis. And the rest of the central area tended to divide up into rectangular plots, linked where possible to some existing roads. It took the whole of Poole Meadow, as we know the area, mainly of the bus station, to be a park with a lake, developing the river that runs through there underground now. And in order to divert traffic round that centre, took as an inner ring road the alignment we know as Queen Victoria Road, Corporation Street, Ford Street, Lower Ford Street, Vickery Street, back through Parkside, to give a circle round the centre to divert traffic of, in those days of course, surface level roads. That concept pleased the politicians. They felt the principles of segregation and some definition of use areas for shopping and business, for civic purposes, education purposes, and so on, residential, were proper courses to be followed. The City Council preferred that option, put it to the citizens, and it effectively became the inspiration for the initial redevelopment. In the years that followed, of course, there were many pressures which, in the event, didn't allow the fulfilment of that grand design in total. There were many reasons. When the plan was drawn, it was effectively sketch plans and models to give impressions of a type of development. But of course it could at that stage have very little regard to what might be the government attitudes to the acquisition of the ownership of all the land involved, to the finances that would be involved in such large-scale change. It didn't know how the acquisition procedures might be allowed. It didn't know during the war years of what the pressures might be after the war, as business got back on its feet again, and, for example, the Chamber of Commerce interests began to be made known relating to a large precinct area. So, as a result of all those pressures, the government ultimately approved what they called a declaratory order area, a very significant area of the city centre where it would be possible for the city council to make compulsory purchase orders.
Yeah, that was 278 acres, I think.
Yes, ultimately the area proposed was reduced by the government, and they put further restrictions on it. They did not allow large areas within that total to be acquired simultaneously. They would only allow compulsory purchase orders to proceed effectively as it was considered the particular land was ripe for redevelopment. This meant that in the period, for example, up to 1971, there'd been 99 compulsory purchase orders of relatively small areas. That meant, of course, that every time that happened, there was an opportunity for objection from either the owners of the land, interests that might be affected by it, and therefore there had to be substantiation of every piece of that jigsaw over those years. And as the war years were left behind, the financial advantages of government grant declined. So there were enormous pressures, and some of them were from conservationists. For example, Priory Row adjoining Broadgate, buildings there were suggested to be cleared and demolished. That had to go to a public inquiry. There was public objection to it, and effectively they were not demolished, they were retained and refurbished. So one can see that there were opportunities for much public participation in the total exercise. And it's interesting that immediately after the war there were objections from the Chamber of Commerce, for example, to the size of the pedestrian area compared with the accessibility to the shops for vehicles. And they therefore suggested that this pedestrian shopping mall should be divided by a new road, which we know now as Smithford Way, Market Way, to reduce the pedestrianised area. And for several years that was in fact inserted back into the development plans. Planning legislation required the City Council to review their plans periodically, and there was a significant review in the period up to 1949, when the government again reviewed proposals from the city, and the result of those proposals was very significant in that this additional road was inserted for the precinct. it retained the road which we know as Hertford Street, running right through the city centre, through Broadgate and down into Trinity Street, although the old Smithford Street had disappeared and was becoming pedestrianised into the shopping precinct. So part of the crossroads had disappeared, but it still had three legs while Hertford Street was still there. But the gridiron plan proposed during the war effectively had to be abandoned because of the enormous cost involved. There was more utilisation of the existing roads. It was found that the inner ring road proposed along Queen Victoria Road and Corporation Street was too near the back of the shopping precinct to be viable, and therefore it was proposed to realign that inner ring road further out, more or less to the alignment that we now know, which is a significant distance further out. It was also decided that it would not be possible to retain the park area north of the cathedral in Pool Meadow. Land values, ownerships, costs involved meant that had to be utilised more productively, and as a result of that, various land uses were reintroduced, including the bus station area as we know it. And it was also found that there was greater pressure from the need for civic buildings, the areas that we now as the civic centre buildings, areas for the redevelopment of the cathedral, taking a greater area, having a new building effectively attached to the ruins of the old. It was found the educational sector, now the Polytechnic, needed significant expansion, and there was more evaluation of the needs of leisure buildings, such as the bars later becoming the leisure centre. Similarly, it was felt some of the residential element would need to be reduced to accommodate more shopping, again because of expansion of population, and more office employment in the central area. So as a result of that, the Gibson plan for the shopping precinct is as we see it. The remainder of the Gibson plan in its formal layout, utilising parkways with formal axes apart from the shopping precinct, wasn't adopted. And the evolution has been a tighter knit, higher density development than Gibson had in the early days envisaged. It is, however, important to realise that the bombing was the catalyst that allowed that spur for change, and it was that spirit that changed the central area into the 40s, 50s, 60s. And one has to remember the span of time that the total implementation of the principles of the plan took, in that the inner ring road wasn't complete until the mid-70s, and it was found necessary to change the concepts within the ring road itself to offer circulation, particularly for buses, public vehicles, cars, in order to offer ready access to the bus stations, to give people access to the shopping centre itself, around the perimeter of it, to give access to all the car parks involved because of the pressure of the increase in the number of vehicles. As a result of that, it was decided to introduce an inner circulatory road, which is inside the ring road.
Yeah, Jack Simpson told us quite a bit about that, actually.
The policies for all those changes were included in a later plan, coordinated into the City of Coventry Review Plan 1966. Again, for that there was very deep public participation by all manner of methods. And the inner circulation then was completed by building some new small links, Greyfriars Road, New Union Street, Fairfax Street, which allowed that inner circulation for vehicles. And that meant that within that inner circulatory system, the Gibson policy of development of pedestrian areas in fact came to fruition because it had this protecting circulation for vehicles. Now, because the major parkway was not possible, because the park north of the cathedral hadn't proved practicable, it was very important that facilities relating to improved environment should still be included. And this meant endeavouring to include open spaces defined now by new buildings generally in differing ways, each space with different character, but not taking as much space as had originally been envisaged. And this was done over the years by the introduction, for example, of Cathedral Square, flanked by the cathedral on high ground, the De Vere Hotel, the halls of residence of the Polytechnic on two other sides. And even proposals like that involved enormous inputs from the community, from adjoining developers, consultations with the Cathedral Council, their architects, the hotel developers, the City Council, the Royal Fine Art Commission. Other spaces were a very significant extension to Greyfriars Green. People at the time were very concerned that the impact of the inner ring road and the inner circulatory route would be detrimental. And there was much criticism during the development of that. But there was general agreement that once the various pedestrian routes were seen and the landscaping began to mature, that it was a very significant enhancement. And then there were open spaces created in front of the council house, new trees. The precinct area itself was intended to include fountains and greenery and seats for general relaxation. And then the conservation lobby over the years became much stronger, that we shouldn't, where practicable, destroy some of the heritage of the more unique buildings. And the result of that was, from 1966 onwards, the move to conserve Spon Street, because Coventry before the war had an enormous number of half-timbered buildings which had either been slum cleared before the war or later on, before the war and during the war, had to go for some of the road improvements. The bombing destroyed many, and we found by then very few remaining. And therefore, with the ultimate blessing of the Historic Buildings Council for England, it was agreed that we could enhance Spon Street by moving into it some of the half-timbered buildings that might be under threat elsewhere. And that process is still going on. And there are other significant buildings. The Priory Row area has been conserved with the cathedral, becomes a conservation area. Lady Herbert's Garden, conservation area. Greyfriars Green, the Quadrant, conservation area. after much public debate, Kirby House in Little Park Street, conserved, has become offices.
But they've actually just preserved the facade, haven't they, behind that? It's a completely new building.
Well, that sometimes has to be done in the sense that you retain the historical continuity. You retain the visual impact of what was there in the centuries in that street. But of course, in some of these buildings, you have to adapt them in some way to give them a useful future life. Because if they're not viable as buildings, someone has to pay for them to be a museum piece. So all these strands came together, linking to, over the years, continuous pedestrian routes. Continuous, obviously, through the precinct shopping areas. Continuous from the station right through to Broadgate. Continuous in the civic area, in the cathedral area, in the Polytechnic City Wall Gosford area. So these were all the elements of the plan for change, remembering that the bombing was an opportunity, a challenge, effectively kicked the ball for something new that has been going on ever since. But a city is a living thing, it's an evolution, and that change is still going on, with proposals in the near future for significant improvements in more contemporary shopping in the central area.